What makes today particularly special is that we are in conversation on the Accountability Initiative platform, which is an initiative that is, of course, my original home and therefore very, very close to my heart. I welcome the opportunity to talk to you on this platform because in particular, I think it allows us to both look at the big picture, but connect the big picture of policy to the brass tacks of implementation on the ground. And what does it take at the grassroots to actually make change happen and reshape the relationship between citizens and state? So that's the broad framing in which I hope to engage you in a conversation. But just to start, I think, Anurag, it would be really helpful for all of us to learn from your perspective about the different ways in which core pillars of society view the state. And I ask you this because I think you have engaged with the state from different perspectives, both from the perspective of private capital in your early professional role, also from the perspective of a philanthropist, and from the perspective of an institution builder, all of which collectively are aimed at both engaging the state, drawing from the state, but also shaping and changing the state. In our field of social policy and accountability, we think of the state very much from the point of view of its relationship with us as citizens, and particularly the relationship it forges vis-a-vis our rights in terms of basic services in particular that we are entitled to from the state, that we expect the state to provide, that the state is obligated to provide. But we often don't get a sense of how these relationships are shaped across the range of institutions that collectively come together to shape state society, to shape markets. So I was very keen for you to reflect on your journey, and in that process, talk to us particularly about business state, business philanthropy, and how that comes together at the cutting edge of citizen-state relations.
Thank you, Yamini. Thank you so much. I hope I'm audible enough. So you talked about the journey that I've had, and in that context, perhaps share a few of my thoughts on this whole matter. So, if I think back to my days in business and state, you could summarize it in one line and say, well, from a business perspective, was you are so messed up, just stay out. So that is the business perspective of the state. I think the social sector perspective or the civil society perspective is you're so messed up and you got to do so much more. Right? So there are sort of two extreme ends that I have dealt with, and both are to some extent valid. They have a degree of truth. They're not completely true, but they have a degree of truth. So, let me, given what I've experienced, and we work intensively with states at every level, right at the ground level, at the grassroots, to the union government. And we've been doing it for the past 20 years. So how do I think about this? Let me frame this, because in the way I think about it, in the way I frame it in my own mind, will perhaps have a bearing on whatever we discuss here on. So I think the first thing that I think about the state is not a monolith. We tend to talk about the state as though it's this one massive, huge entity, right? It's not that at all. It is many states within this. When I say state, I'm using small s, So if you start thinking about it as one monolith, you're bound to misunderstand it, you're bound to mischaracterize it, and you're bound to then not be effective. Effective in demanding, effective in doing effective and collaborating whichever way. So I think that's very important to my mind. Second, that since it's not a monolith, I think it's very useful to characterize the different parts of the state that one would deal with, one encounters, or one has to encounter in their own right. The way you would characterize the ministries and departments of industries and business, the way they function, is very different from the way very many of the social sector departments function. But even that is oversimplifying the matter. If you take the departments of education, how that functions and what is the state as the individual encounters it is very different at the grassroots in the Department of Education when you deal with a teacher and a school versus when you deal with the block education officer and the principal secretary of education. So the state is not a monolith. For us to be effective in anything that we want with the state, or for the state to be effective, we have to understand and characterize it with its own validity for its various parts. Third, people matter. Many of us who would like to perhaps, or who would welcome the simplification of a model, the simplification of saying, this are the pieces of the state, these are the rights and the duties, and these are the mechanisms and the processes, and perhaps the political culture. It defies all that. People matter. So now you have this thing that is not a monolith. It has to be characterized in all its glorious and bewildering parts. And then within that, people matter. Right? Fourth and fifth are, it might sound sort of curious to some of our friends on the call, but when talking of the state, it's quite impossible to do this characterization in all its glorious validity or its diversity, accounting for the people that matter. Doing that is also not possible unless you account for yourself. So when we are talking about the state, who you are matters. What are you wanting matters. What's your background? What's your intention? Which stakeholder are you? Which stakeholder are you representing? That matters, because each of those bewildering parts behave very differently depending on who you are. And lastly, it matters how you behave with them. And again, as I said, this is the messy reality. It's very hard to characterize this in a very simple paper. How you behave matters. So it's frustrating that why should the state be of a nature which is so diverse in its own characteristics? And on top of that, why does it matter that how do we behave with any one of those parts and they respond in that fashion? Right? So I feel that unless we accept, even if not embrace, unless we accept this sort of complicated, complex, confusing reality, it's very difficult to move forward. In fact, very often I think of it in this manner that, when we have a discussion of this nature or when somebody writes a paper, what happens is we are trying to abstract something. We're trying to build a model. And we all know that models have their uses, but all models are actually wrong. The issue with the state is it's like a rigid frame or a series of rigid frames which are all in Brownian motion. And those of you who might remember your school physics, Brownian motion is this completely random motion that's going on, right? So that's the way the state is. And I think that's the way I have experienced it. Even more importantly, I think that's the frame which I have found to be useful to be able to deal with the state, right? So now when you take this frame and then you put that in the context of any one of the questions that we may have, then at least my perspective to myself becomes clearer.
Thank you, Anurag. That was a really, really helpful way of framing it, both as a reminder that who you are matters a lot to how you view the state, and that the state itself is not a monolithic single entity. It's actually a multiplicity of different actors, different people, different shapes that come together, which together shape what one ultimately calls the state, and together shape what one ultimately is trying to engage with, hold accountable, and ensure that it delivers on its promise. But let me just, ask you to reflect a bit on your own experiences with the state, and I'll tell you where I'm coming from. In Delhi in the 1990s, where I grew up and when I went to college, there was a very, very deep moment of celebration that reflects on where you started, about how business views the state as an entity with great many problems and is best kept far, far away. And we were, I think, the first generation all of us who had very close connections with the state as we were growing up, but at the same time were part of a generation that was beginning to celebrate the exit of the state from our everyday lives. In my personal experience, the most visible factor here was a single landline. I'm one of 3 siblings, and as teenagers, all 3 of us would have huge squabbles when school would finish, running back home just over who would get access to that single landline first. And then privatization happens. The state slowly starts getting out of the way, and suddenly you have access to multiple lines, and mobile phones slowly start entering, and so on and so forth. Our entire relationship with the state starts changing, and it's a moment of great celebration. But when I started, exploring possible professional choices, and went into rural India with a few NGOs, what really struck me was everywhere we went, and at that time I was doing a lot of work in rural Rajasthan, was the absence of the state in ways that were not quite being celebrated, in that wherever we went, one constantly heard the refrain, सरकार आएगी तो सड़क बनेगी, सरकार आएगी तो स्कूल बनेगा, सरकार आएगी तो स्वास्थ्य केंद्र बनेगा. There was an expectation and an imagination of a state that was to come and a state that was to provide. And in that provision, I would see an enhancement of my life's chances, my children's life chances. And that, to me, I think has framed a lot of how I have viewed our complex relationship with the state, and has raised sets of questions that I wanted to pose to you. It seems to me that at one level, the Indian elite have a great disenchantment with the state, perhaps because the state hasn't delivered, and in particular, when you think of private capital and its relationship with the state. As much as the average Indian recognizes the pernicious elements of the Indian state, as you say, they need the state, they want the state, they want the state to do better. But what we find in the sort of policy making structures that determine how the state provides you the school, how the state provides you the health center, how the state provides you the road, this tussle between the necessary elements of what the state must and should do and this elite disenchantment with the state has come together in a way that I often find when the state talks about itself, particularly on these core functions that the state has to provide, it allows its disenchantment with itself to get the better of it. It often says, हम नहीं कर सकते हैं, कहीं कोई public private partnership आके करेगा या कोई NGO आके करेगा. And I wanted to pose this particular question to you because in some ways your work in the Azim Premji Foundation in education sought to sit between this. It engaged, perhaps a space opened up because of the disenchantment. I'm speculating here, but I wanted to hear your sense of it. And in some ways, it provided an opportunity to see what the state could do. So your reflections both on the disenchantment, potentially, whether my articulation of this is right or wrong, I would be very keen to hear how the elite view these core functions of the state, And what spaces open up then for sort of, we use the term non-state actors, which I don't like at all. So I struggle for innovation that comes from outside of the state, for the state to which rests on the hope that the state can actually take this innovation and do better. How do these two tensions play out in your experiences?
So, yeah, we grew up with those one single phone lines, and now each of us have two phones or more. So, but the problem is that we have started believing that just because we have phones, there is no role for the public, right? And I mean, that's perhaps one of the most corrosive things that has happened to our country and perhaps much across the world. And that is the other side of this coin, or the other side of the story that you talked about. So the partly deliberate and in large part non-deliberate, right? The partly deliberate and then in a large part non-deliberate vacating the sphere which is the public, right? And as far as we are concerned, in this kind of a democracy, the state is the most important structure of the public, right? The state and the government. So we don't have an alternative structure for the public, and therefore the public goods to be organized, to be delivered, that the state has to take responsibility of, and that went out. And as I said, partly deliberate, partly non-deliberate. It went out with the notion that, well, we must not bake bread, which is true. We must not make jam, which is true. Perhaps we shouldn't fly airlines, which is also true. But then what about health and education and security and water and infrastructure, by the way, right? So the notion, the demolition of the notion of the public, right, is, I think, perhaps one of the most corrosive things that's happened in the past 20, 25 odd years. Now, having said that, if I look at the phrase that you use, the word that you use, disenchantment, I think perhaps there are three kinds of disenchantments that I see inside the government. And this is the reason I framed my own view of the state in the way I did, because once I have the frame, I can actually keep putting back whatever we discuss into that frame. So, as I mentioned, I don't think that the state is a monolith. I think people matter in the state. And therefore, when you talk of disenchantment, that disenchantment is really perhaps best pinned on people, right? You could pin it other ways, but it's best pinned on people. And I see three kinds of disenchantments. One is an ideological disenchantment, which is this fanatical marketism, that everything can be solved by the market, right? So that's one kind of disenchantment. The second is, let me call it a pragmatic disenchantment. And the pragmatic disenchantment is, well, it's very clear to us that, education and security and water, state has to make it happen, but we are not able to do it, right? So could we somehow partner with private actors, whether they're philanthropic or for-profit, let's keep that aside for the time being, but could we partner with them and perhaps make things happen? So that's what I'm calling the pragmatic disenchanted. And the third is what I would call the lazy disenchanted, right? They're just lazy. So, I mean, yeah, people are demanding stuff and therefore we don't want to do it and anyway we can't do it. So let me just outsource it. And given my characterization, and I deeply believe in that characterization, I've come across a fair share of all three kinds of disenchanted. Now, I shouldn't stop here because that would suggest that this is the only kind of people that exist in the state today. And that's not true. You still have a sizable minority who are deeply committed to the idea of the role of the state to deliver public goods, to ensure public goods, to ensure the public sphere, right? So they are also there, but because you started off with disenchantment, I was mentioning these three kind of the disenchanted, right? The first kind of disenchanted, the die-hard market loyalists, I think they are beyond redemption. Right? If after 25, 30 years, 40 years of this failed experiment across the world, they cannot see, they are unwilling to see that all that's public cannot be delivered by private for-profit market mechanisms, then, I find it a waste of time in dealing with people of that kind. Right? Is the pragmatic and the lazy disenchanted that I think are really relevant. Right? And of course, those who are not disenchanted, who still are full with the spirit and fire of trying to do something which is truly the duty of the state or truly the role the state can play. They're of course there. And I think it's this space that gets created by the disenchanted who are pragmatic and the disenchanted who are lazy, which presents possibilities for various kinds of actors. And the possibilities that it presents, and again, it forks out into, I think, one which is a very problematic possibility, and the other which is not the most desirable situation for our country to have, but is nevertheless is better than the other possibility. The first possibility is this going back to market, going back to for-profit entities, right? With the belief that, yes, this is not for the market, but what do? We got to somehow get the efficiency and organizing ability and the people who can do things into this stuff, and let's get them here, right? And that, I think, is a very uneasy compromise that people make. And that's just the thin end of the wedge, right? Because you've already said, well, because of the pragmatic issues, I will compromise on the role of the state, and you let for-profit market mechanisms in, and that's sort of a very slippery slope. And then a situation like this also presents to you the possibility of saying, look, we are where we are. The education system, you've dealt with it. The health system, you deal with it. We are where we are. Pragmatically, let's get all the help that can come. It can be for business help. And therefore, let's seek out people who have good intentions and who have the capacity to work together to do something. Right? And I think it's that space that we have found over the past 20, 25 years, which exists in abundance, right? It exists in abundance. It's not, again, let me not mischaracterize the situation by saying that that's the large portion of the space that exists. You still have the market fundamentalists. You still have these people who are rooting for business as a pragmatic maneuver, but you still have the space where, state actors, people inside the state, create the space for civil society actors or philanthropic bodies. Now, let me point out two critical things here, which has been very, very, very strong reaffirmations for us anytime and every time that we have dealt with anybody within the state, right? And which is that space, it cannot be taken as an entitlement. That space is a function of course, the state actors creating that space for you, but that space is a function of two things. I think the first one is up in everybody's consciousness right now, and which is, what's the intention of the civil society actor, the philanthropic actor? Is the intention truly and actually to deliver, strengthen, improve the public? Or is some other intention there? And I think it's this kind of messy human reality that really shapes things a lot eventually. So what is the real intention of that actor is hugely determinant on the space that actually opens up and what you end up making out of it. So that's one. Second, which I feel is just too often underestimated, not adequately talked about, is what's your competence, right? So you got this good intention civil servant, public servant, and given the history of that, what we have at 20, 25, 30 years, the space is there. We can work in that space together. And too often, I think we in the social sector, civil society, we start believing that somehow good intentions, commitment, zeal, that is a substitute enough for competence and capability and capacity, and which it is not, right? So, my own area of work, school education, anybody and everybody wants to train teachers, right? And, and it's truly remarkable, I mean, why do you think that you can train teachers? Huh? So I was giving you the example and I was saying, look, that space is so much dependent on not just what the state actors are doing, but what you are in some senses. And one was the matter of intention, etc. And the second was this matter of what's our competence, what's our capability. And I was giving the example of, we work in school education, and the capacity of teachers is really critical, absolutely central to what's happening in school education. And you look around, and anybody and everybody wants to train teachers. Right? And why do you believe that you can train teachers? It's like, to my mind, a wonderful example is that just because one of us has had the unfortunate experience of having an open heart surgery, we start believing that we can start training cardiac surgeons, right? It's like, I went through school, therefore I know now I have done an MSc or a BTech or whatever, and I'll start training teachers. So the matter of competence matters hugely, hugely. So every time that we feel that, why is the space shrinking, right? Why don't we have the space? Why aren't they responding? Partly it's a matter of your intentions, but assume that they are all the right and good intentions. It's often a matter of your competence, right? So that's been a consistent experience that we've had, right? I must also share that if you think of the space in another way now, and one is, let's just call it about delivery, which is, you got a space, can we improve education by doing things better, right? And on the other hand, you have this space about what should you be doing? What should be policy? What are our policy goals, right? What are the goals of education, right, at that level? So, if you sort of, for this discussion, separate them out like that, the delivery of the public goods, and then the nature of public goods, their goals, their basic character, right? If you separate them in those two ways. Civil society has a role in both sides, clearly has a role in both sides. But I think it's very important, very, very important, that we act differently depending on what are we engaging with. In the context of what I was, and I sort of recoil at the phrase service delivery, because education is not service delivery in my world, right? Education is a really complex and valued social human process. So I'll keep my reluctances aside. So if you're engaging with service delivery, you need to align behind whatever the goals are which the state has set out. In some senses, and I'm using this as an illustration, the curriculum is a given, the goals of the curriculum are a given, and therefore to achieve those goals of the curriculum, you should align behind that. And so you are not influencing the goals. You're not influencing what is the virtue that education is trying to develop among students, right? So I think that's important. That's very important to recognize that if you're in that space, you're aligning behind the goals as set out by the state. And that's a worthwhile endeavor. We need many, many actors in that space. Now you come to the other side. You come to the other side where you're actually shaping or influencing the shaping of goals in whatever manner. The word policy is it's such an amorphous kind of a phrase or word that it's used for everything and anything. So let's just use the word goals and virtues, so to say. Now, if you're shaping what are the goals and what are the virtues, right? In that case, I think there is a great degree of transparency demanded of the civil society actors, a great degree of transparency. And if I have a quarrel my quarrel is that that is not is not as often the case as it should be. You must be clear. I mean, if you're trying to shape goals, what I'm calling goals and virtues, you should be transparent about your commitments, about your stance, and about your ideologies, right? And this wonderful thing that I hear from very many of my friends is that, we don't have ideology. That's just that's a mug's game, right? So it's a cop out. So that's not true. But so therefore, if you're trying to shape policy, shape goals, shape virtues, right, it is absolutely critical that we be transparent about our stand, our ideology, and our commitments. Right? So I think in addition to that matter of intention and competence, depending on which kind of space you're dealing with, I think these two things are also something that I have found very important.
Thank you, Anurag. You've really laid out some of the most critical tensions actually in state-civil society relationships, particularly in both your framing of the disenchantments, the three disenchantments that comes back to how we should be talking about the role of civil society actors, the intention, the competence, the ideology, and linked to that, the transparency and the accountability. These are some very important questions that I think as a community, we don't debate enough. In fact, one of the challenges I've often confronted myself personally as a sort of as an institution and as an individual that sits within the sort of interface of policy and research is sort of where does our role begin and end in that is our role to present a set of ideas and offer a set of expertise to government at whichever level, in whichever form, and then leave it for government to negotiate, to allow the politics to operate the way politics needs to, and to finally shape the policy? Or is it actually to write the policy? And I worry a lot that we, in fact, tend to encourage this blurring of boundaries between what we offer as external actors, all of which I think are very crucial to making the state function better. But we often tend to confuse ourselves as becoming the state, perhaps fueled by our own disenchantments, rather than of offering what we have to the state and holding the state accountable for interpreting this expertise, and then for converting this expertise or these sets of ideas or these sets of research into actual policy and practice. And I think that it's in that blurring of boundaries that these very critical questions you raise about ideology, about transparency and accountability become central. And to me, one of the reasons why this blurring of boundaries has become so easy is because we don't actually hold the state accountable enough for its own failures. We choose to become the state whenever we get frustrated with the state. And this is both both those who are market fundamentalists and those who are state fundamentalists as well, in a sense, as our own different versions of frustration start coming together. The sense of actually holding the state accountable gets blurred with becoming the state. And to me, that raises very, very critical questions for this relationship between state, society, and market that is framing our conversation today. But let me sort of push towards the second part of our conversation, which was to take these ideas and place them in the context of our everyday interactions with grassroots state actors at the cutting edge of policy implementation. And here I was very keen to hear your reflections on how you see the everyday state, what I call the everyday state actor, the teacher, the block education officer, the district education officer, who really is the state for most of India, in a sense. How do they see their own relationship with the state? In my own work, I have experienced this disenchantment from the perspectives of the frontline state. Very much in a complex way. I see these actors as keen to be part of the state for the power that being a state actor offers, the status it gives you in society. And of course, for some, perhaps not for all, the opportunity to actually be in service of society. But at the same time, I see their experiences within the state leaving them remarkably disempowered. So much so that, often we've been doing sort of my own research interests have driven me to try and capture perspectives of frontline actors. And in the course of these interviews, conversations, often ask them, what is it that they would like to do to improve education or to improve healthcare in the areas where they work. And one of the stunning responses I have got is a sort of shrug of the shoulders कि अगर सरकार चाहती है तो बहुत कुछ कर सकती है, which to me has always been quite a important response to understand. The disenchanted people will dismiss this as the apathetic state, but for me it's a reminder that there's something very complex about the relationship that frontline state actors have with the state, where they see themselves in some ways as very distanced from the power of the state, even as they embody that power in their relationships with citizens. And I see that tension as being very critical to how implementation plays out. And I was very keen to hear your reflections on this. Just how do actors within the state, and you have traveled the country, you have talked to lakhs and lakhs of state actors that matter more than any prime minister to the everyday lives of Indians. Your perspective on how they understand themselves and the state.
Yamini, that last statement of yours, I wish a country would take it to heart. That that the front line, it matters more than anything else in this world.
And
so
yet,
true.
We always assume that the way to solve the Indian state's problems is to discipline the front line. And I have to say, in my own early framings of accountability, that was very much how I viewed this. But the more and more I engaged, I realized that that's exactly the wrong approach. And anybody that thinks that disciplining the front line is the solution to the problem is in fact the core part of the problem.
Yeah. I'll go to the specifics, not the specific, the broad set of matters that you wanted to talk about. But in this context, one of the things that I find greatly illuminating is to reflect on past 10,000 years of human conflict, state conflict, right? And can any one of us remember a single war or battle that was lost because of the soldiers? And in our country, we are saying, look, we're losing this war and we're losing that battle, and let's keep punishing the soldiers. So that's why I said, if we could take your last statement to heart, things would perhaps be very different. The other curiously funny thing is this matter of disempowerment that you talked about, disempowerment, disenchantment, alienation that you talked about. That सरकार चाहती है तो बहुत कुछ कर सकती है, meaning मैं तो हूं नहीं सरकार में, मैं तो disempowered हूं. Now that's true not just of the primary school teacher out there, or the primary healthcare worker, which is the ASHA worker, or even the taluka health officer. It's not just true of them. Curiously and funnily enough, it's true of the principal secretary at the state capital. Very often, it's true of the secretaries in Government of India, right? So I think, and that tells us something important, right? That this matter of disempowerment and the way it leads people to behave is something that is there in the operating ethos of the system. And it's a function of, there's no way of our today recounting what all is it a function of. It's a function of many things. For example, the musical chair that goes on in roles. And the moment somebody new comes in the role, he or she has her favorite or the flavor of the week and the flavor of the month, and those horses are run their course so long as that person is there. So this matter of disempowerment, I think, is a fundamental characteristic of the operating ethos that seems to have developed, certainly in our country. I haven't experienced other state systems as closely, so I won't be able to comment whether it's an inherent part of large state systems or an integral part of a large state system, but certainly it's true of in our country. Now, if we go back to the specific set of people, specific category of people that you're talking about, which you characterize as the frontline, which is the teacher and the primary healthcare center, or even the district hospital. Right? Now, what's been our experience there? And again, I'm deliberately going to go back to the way that I had framed the 5 points of my framing, right? Deliberately, because as I mentioned earlier, I have found that framing useful in operating. It's not a framing for abstraction of writing a research paper. It's a framing for operations in the way we run our operations. So I'm going to go back to the framing. And when you look at the front line, first you have to look at yourself. And one has to ask of ourselves, what are we trying to do? Are we actually going to be able to, in any meaningful way, however small, but any meaningful way, make a dent in what I call the operating ethos of the system? And our experience after 20 years and is that it's very hard to do that. Very, very hard to do that. These things are beyond us. I'm talking about the Azim Premji Foundation. I'm concerned about my colleagues in civil society who start believing that they can have a meaningful impact on the operating ethos of our system. And I am certainly not the right person to be able to illuminate what might change that operating ethos. It is something which is far more complex than what we can do. And I say that I'm concerned about other civil society actors who start believing that they can change the operating ethos, because I'm very conscious of the privileged nature that we as an organization have. We are not short of money, we are not short of people, we are not short of connections, we are not short of space. Despite all that, it's beyond our grasp, the matter of the operating ethos. And therefore, when I start looking at the front end or even at the principal secretary, how do I frame what I think can be done or actually is effective? And in the way I frame it, it might sound simplistic, but that's what I have found to be effective, which is that the person out there in the front is the average Indian. And the average Indian is a sum total of the average Indian's characteristics. Some will be very hardworking or less hardworking. Some will be inspired, energized, animated by higher goals of life, that they're using education or they're contributing to education because they want to build this country. There are others who are there just because, they're getting a salary, they don't even show up. So you have the average Indian there. With 9.5 million teachers, you just have the average Indian. With similar kind of number of health workers, you have the average Indian there. And we as civil society actors, when we are fairly clear that we are finding it very hard, almost impossible to change the operating ethos of the system, our approach has been that fine, let's put together, let's work with, let's collaborate with a coalition which is on the normal curve of, let's just oversimplify things. Let me just oversimplify things for the sake of brevity and call it good and bad, this side good, this side bad, right? So let me just figure out a way by which I can work with the good. They also feel disempowered. They face the same operating ethos and the operating chaos. And if we can figure out mechanisms by which one can work with them or the spaces that are created by them, then it is going to be far more effective. It's certainly far more effective use of our energy, our time, and our focus. And the reason I have found it's very effective is one being that when this group, which I have oversimplified and called good, or the normal curve of good this side, they find a partner who has the right intention and has the competence to go back to my framing, then when they're feeling disempowered, they say, well, okay, let's get together and do something. And that's true right in the front end with the teacher. It's true with the head teacher. It's true with the block education officer. It's true with the district education officer. It's true with the principal secretary. So 20 years of working, and I'm sort of quickly going up levels, going to principal secretaries. Principal secretaries do have influence in the education system of a state. And there are, in all years of working across multiple states, you find situations where you have this the principal secretary who feels disempowered, disenchanted, the earlier word you used, and but is actually in my normal curve on the good side. And if you could figure out a way of collaborating with him or her, then you get far. And that sort of sinks back into, again, to my original frame, that people matter. The notion that somehow systems will take care, we will institutionalize, in quotes, which is a very fond hope that very many of us tend to have. It is not true of our system as of now. And we are unable to make it true. So what I was calling the operating ethos, that we are not able to influence. So we take the characteristics of the system as they are, and we try to be as effective as possible within the characteristics of that system. And this entire description that I shared with you, it's very, 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 very true on what I had called the delivery side. Perhaps the dynamics are slightly different on what I had called working on shaping the goals or influencing the goals and virtues, right? So now, whether I look at the education system, whether I look at the criminal justice system, whether I look at the child care system, whether I look at issues of gender, whether in agriculture, I have found the same to be true. And if I were to sort of wrap up this whole thing that I've said, it's in a very simple way saying that, look, understand the characteristics of the system. The operating ethos, you can't hope to really change it in any meaningful way. People matter, and people are the average people out there. The notion that somehow the people in the government are more incompetent than us is false. They're as competent or as incompetent as us. So find out those people who are competent and good and collaborate with them. It's to my mind as simple as that. And when one tries to abstract it into something else, operationally, it becomes impossible to handle. And in fact, a lot of the frustration that I find with extremely competent, extremely good intentioned civil society actors is because they are banging their head against this concrete wall of what I have called the operating ethos. It will not change. Right? On the matter of shaping the goals and shaping the virtues or influencing the goals and the virtues, perhaps we can come back to it in another part of the conversation.
Thanks, Anurag. I think you've really taken us through to a really important point on the issue of what does it take actually. In fact, I was just looking at some of the questions that were coming up, and various people are asking about experiences across states, across districts, where what matters. And I think ultimately, as you rightly say, what matters is people, and what matters is identifying the individuals that are capable, are motivated, enthused to be change agents within a system, and engage with them and work with them. But I will say that I think in that process, actually, we are seeding potential of changing ethos. I think one of the problems with particularly how economists view the world is that the assumptions are it's all about incentives shaped through a contract, but institutions and systems are social organizations in which individuals shape the ethos and its cultures a lot. And I do think that there is scope of shaping ethos. It's simple things. Who are role models within the bureaucracy? Who are the ones who can make change? The way in which they make those changes shape how those within the system view what the system can and cannot do, what it is capable of. I think, one of the experiences we had, the simple act of a district magistrate coming into the office every morning and in their morning meetings, instead of shouting at everybody कि तुमने कितने टीचर्स को ट्रेन किया या कितने स्कूल बनाए और जितना तुम्हारा टारगेट था उसको तुमने अचीव नहीं किया और सबको डंडा मार दिया, वर्सेस सेइंग टारगेट अचीव नहीं करने में क्या क्या दिक्कतें आई और उनका हल हम किस तरीके से निकालें, immediately had an impact on how these individuals were viewing themselves. Suddenly they felt part of a process of change, as opposed to being beaten up into being made to feel less capable of making change. So I did want to challenge you on that, because I do think that there is, obviously it is not for civil society actors to shape and change ethos. I think it's very important for us to recognize it, but within democracies, institutions are in every way a reflection of the relationships that it forges with society. And when society partners to infuse innovation, that innovation could potentially plant seeds of changing ethos, not changing the contract, changing ethos.
Why would I feel challenged, Yamini? I can only say inshallah,
Well, I brought you to this inshallah point because in our conversation, because it is with this inshallah that Accountability Initiative experimented with and has conceptual, and through those experimentations conceptualized and today launching its course. And essentially the roots of this came from our myriad interactions with all the state actors that we've been speaking about, many of whom were really keen to have a better understanding of this larger context in which they work, and be more engaged with it. And we found, where even even activism actually, but more than that, research tends to draw from actors on the ground, but rarely bothers to give back. So big research studies and all our funders will ask us, what is your impact? And we'll say we had meetings with XYZ. And in those XYZ, none of those who are actually charged with implementing, from whom we have extracted information, become part of that process at all. And we began experimenting just with sharing our data, what we learned with district administration, with block administration. And in that process felt that there was a potential of engaging with frontline actors, as well as with civil society actors that are constantly engaging with the frontline, for to have a deeper understanding of the state itself. And sometimes it's as simple as budget line item kaun sa hai. It helps with activism to know that. But it also helps the state to know that. It also helps people who are engaging the state to know that. What is the structure of a scheme? What is the structure of the program? What is the imagined role of local governments, of block administrations? What is its real role? And in that process, engaging in dialogue and deliberation, that I think, inshallah, one hopes are part, at least a small chipping at this very, very big rock of ethos changing and ethos shaping.